Hi, my name is Peter Orpin. I'm a veterinary surgeon in the Park Vet Group in Leicestershire and also director of My Healthy Herd. John Cook, who's a well-respected veterinary surgeon who worked for ABS Genus for several years, was in practice for nearly 20 years and is now working for Valley Agricultural Software, which make dairy comp. He came recently and gave a fantastic presentation to our farmers on transition health management. And I'd just like to summarise some of the key slides that he gave us on the day. What he illustrated was that really transition problems are really emanating from energy balance and calcium balance and immune competence. And if we don't get it right, if we don't get the transition right, we end up with a heap of disease, lower production than we should do, and poor reproductive performance. The other area that John explored was the impact of the actual follicle. If we damage the actual follicle by poor energy state, infection, disease, heat stress, then 60 days later, when that follicle matures, it will form a poor quality embryo, and it's not likely to actually maintain the pregnancy. So it seems the 60-day thing really came through on the talk. I think it's quite important to appreciate that, any fertility effects, we have to go back a minimum of 60 days to see what event happened then, because that's what's actually contributed to that poor fertility event. John Lender just described the whole concept of what the transition period is. The transition period is really made up of this close-up period and fresh group period, this 3 weeks either side of calving. And the best way of looking at it is the actual transition period. We really should say the next lactation starts when the cow goes dry. If we think of it that way, rather than saying, well, the lactation starts when the cow calves, if we thought, well, the lactation really starts, we need to think about the next lactation when the cow goes dry, and we actually manage the dry period and the transition period well, then the actual lactation period will go very, very well. The period very close to calving is a really difficult thing for us to manage because there's lots of things going on at that time, so we have to be very, very good in terms of managing our cows at that point. And we've got to achieve a real consistent nutrition, a real consistency of our routines throughout that period. What John described as well is that, it's a great way of graphically explaining it, is that the cows are hardwired to eat throughout their lactation, so they've got a very, very strong drive to eat. But basically when they approach calving, they lose their drive, so it's quite easy to actually switch the cows off, and they won't eat what they should do, and the dry matter intake drops, and then they end up with further problems. So we have to respect that. We have to respect that. We have to understand that the cow is going through a heap of issues in those days around either side of calving, particularly relating to calcium control, energy inputs, and their immunity is severely compromised as well. So they are in a fairly fragile state, and I perhaps think that in many farms we don't appreciate that they're probably the most difficult time for the cow within the actual calving year. What are we trying to achieve with the transition period? What we're trying to do is to adapt the rumen to high energy feeds. We are trying to make sure that the blood calcium is maintained, so we not only sort of prevent milk fever, but we maintain a normal blood calcium, so we don't have hypocalcemia, because hypocalcemia, just a subclinical level of low calcium, that can be enough to actually impair future fertility, but also the problems with calving. It's important that we try and build as strong an immune system as we can, and we want to try and maintain this positive energy balance throughout the dry period. John alludes to the fact that if you actually treat the cows too hard in the far off period and they go into energy deficit, then that can be very deleterious to future fertility. Similarly, if we actually really put the cows into negative energy balance in the immediate transition period in the days before calving, the same thing applies. You're likely to damaging the developing follicles, so it's very, very important we get that right. We have got to maintain the rumen, flora and fauna and protein balance That's probably really overemphasised in his view. He feels the most important thing is to achieve a rumen mat within the rumen so that the bugs can survive, and the rumen probably adapts faster than we give credit to. So there's not a requirement for sort of 3 weeks for the diet to change or anything. I think it's important just to get a good stable diet there as well. And we are trying to actually try and reduce individual variation and make sure we've got good gut capacity within the cows. This is a classic graph here that explains what happens with the dry matter intake. You know, we're aiming to try and maintain the dry matter intake in a Holstein cow between sort of 13-14 kilos, but in a number of cows it will actually drop right down just at the point of calving, and this is quite often where the energy deficit occurs, and it then tracks upwards. And if you look at cows carefully, some cows will go straight through with a very minimal drop, some cows will have quite a severe drop. And these cows that have quite a severe drop are then more likely to go on and develop fertility problems, metritis, cysts, and all these sort of sequelae. So it's so important. This period here is a really important period in the cow's life. Why does the dry matter intake drop? Well, several reasons for it. There is a greater drop with cows, so age, the older the cow is, there's a greater risk of dry matter intake drop. Fetal size is, in his view, he felt was over-represented as a potential issue, but obviously if cows have difficult calvings because of giant calves, that's certainly not going to help dry matter intake. Cow condition is crucial though. Over-fat cows, that really reduces the ability of the cow to actually pack in dry matter intake pre-calving. The ration composition, you know, this is normally something which, with a good competent nutritionist, you should be able to get that right, but it is important that that is properly constructed. One area that John did talk about though was the actual effect of the hormones. You know, the hormonal effect on the cow is quite dramatic. The direct effect on estrogen and the other hormones has a real impact on the dry matter intake for the cow. So it is challenging for the cow to actually eat as much as you'd like. Any metabolic disorders, anything that reduces calcium for instance, that's not going to help. But the bit at the bottom, management and environment, these are huge. This is grouping, this is trough space. You know, these are the things that are coming to the fore now in terms of trying to make sure we get dry matter intake into these pre-calving cows. These cows don't have a strong appetite, they can't afford to be bullied at the feed phase, because if they are bullied, then we'll actually see a drop in actual dry matter intake at a time when they can ill afford it. This slide just shows, you know, what happens if you're a fat cow. You're a much greater risk of actually having this more rapid decline in dry matter intake, and this is expressed in terms of percentage of adult body weight. So what we can take from this graph here is that fat cows have a lower intake than thin cows, and that drop off occurs several days before the cow starts to calve. The hormone changes at calving, these are the classic sort of fertility hormones, progesterone and estrogen. You can see that those change, but there are a whole stack of other hormonal changes that occur at the same time, and these are what is thought to actually unscramble the cow's ability to sort of almost like think and eat and perform as she should. You know, this is what's actually causing a lot of difficulties for the cow around calving. The best way of actually sort of managing and measuring the actual cow's energy balance is to look at NEFAs, which is non-esterified fatty acids. Now, in a normal cow, they will start to rise, and the critical cutoff is 350-400, and we're looking to try and keep cows below that. But if we have cows that start tracking up with high NEFAs pre-calving, then we can say, well, these cows are already under energy stress. And we also know that cows under energy stress pre-calving are going to make them more likely to develop energy stress post-calving. So that's another top tip. You know, we can simply measure the actual levels of blood NEFAs in the pre-calving cows to check whether our transitioning program is working as well as it should. The ketones, we're doing this already in practice. We've now got handheld meters that can measure this, but we can actually measure ketones very well in milking cows. It doesn't work quite so well in the pre-calving cows, and certainly if we have high ketones in pre-calving cows, we have quite disastrous energy problems. We then talked a bit about clinical milk fever. I mean, really we're aiming to try and remove this from the equation. We're trying to do better than just control clinical milk fever. It's not about that anymore. What we want to do is to produce a diet and a regime which reduces the actual chance of hypocalcemia, so that we've got cows that aren't running around with hypocalcemia. Work in the States and the UK have shown that 45% of older cows in an average UK dairy herd are hypocalcemic, and up to 15% of even first lactation cows. There's a tremendous demand at calving time for calcium, and that severe deficiency will result in milk fever, but the less severe results in subclinical. And these subclinical effects contribute towards retained placenta, metritis, displaced mace, and mastitis, and whatsoever. The way we try and minimise it now is to feed a low-risk diet. We try and find a diet which is low risk for milk fever, and generally that's a diet with reduced potassium levels. And that's, you try and avoid grasses and grass silages, and you try to favour diets which have a good decad balance, which would be including maize silage or haylage made from a field where no potash or slurry has been applied. There are solutions here to milk fever. This is Bovicalc. This is something which is quite commonly used now. This is a calcium oral bolus which is used to load up the rumen just prior to calving. This will go a long way to preventing clinical milk fever, but obviously it is not the whole solution, because we do need to prevent the subclinical effects as well. So we must look to the diet first and foremost. Busy slide here. This slide really just illustrates conception rates in the cows, and this was a bigger farm that John was involved in, and what they were able to do is to show that this herd had a very low level of fertility, and they were able to improve the fertility of this herd by focusing more and more efforts actually on the transition. So really all that happened in this herd was improvements in transition cow management. So this shows you what can be gained. We were running at a 25% conception rate, and now at 40-50% conception rate. Huge gains, huge economic gains from improving transition cow management. A bit of time was spent talking about immune function, and what we basically were able to discuss was that the white cells showed decreased ability to function, and this is really affected by hormonal changes. So to try and help the immune system, we want to try and prevent milk fever, make sure we get adequate minerals in there, particularly selenium and vitamin E, avoid protein energy deficiency, and obviously consider trace minerals, and the classic stress thing, I think, which mustn't be underestimated. If we stress these cows in any way, that's going to magnify the problem with the poor immune function. And this graph just illustrates the actual immune function here of these are the neutrophil count and lymphocyte counts, and neutrophils are what are used to, say for instance, defend against E. coli mastitis. And you can see why we have problems with mastitis around calving. A cow down with milk fever, she may have subclinical ketosis, she's stressed, her immunity is flat on the floor, and then any infection will contribute towards mastitis. Botrytis, really this just follows on the work that we've talked about for some years now, that after calving the majority of cows are infected, but not all cows go on to develop a sort of a long-term infection. The self-cure rate is very good, so in well-fed, well-managed cows, by 21-28 days we've actually removed the infection. And this shows what goes on and what we're aiming to try and do here. A cow might start with metritis, but if it's well fed and has a good energy balance and good mineral balance and is stress free, and the self-cure rate is very good, and they'll progress right the way through subclinical inflammation through to normality. Why this is important is that the actual conception rates of these cows here is about 0%. The normal cows maybe up to 60%, and these subclinical ones are typically your 20-30% conception rates. So what we want to try and do is to manage our transitions so that we can try and push as many cows as possible through to the normal element. We can use treatments, but treatments alone will not work. We need treatments plus a cow that's got the ability to mount an effective immune response. John then talks about the effects of metritis, just massive effects, huge ability to reduce conception rates, extend calving intervals, increases the risk of cystic ovarian disease, and obviously increases your cull rate. And also has direct effect on dry matter and milk yield. So, really important to get it right. And if we're looking to reduce the risk of metritis, we have to look at the transition period. He also shared with us some old data here, 1998, where they just compared cows that had metritis with ones that didn't have metritis, and they basically looked just over a 20-day period, and they found that their dry matter intake was 4 kilo less and almost 8 litres less milk yield per day. So huge production effects. And you can see these cows are being pushed up the slow track. These cows are not going to be cows which are easy to get in calf. They've gone down the slow track already. So transition and production, this is the production levels here, and what we're seeking to try and do is to get more and more cows producing more milk, and in order to do that we need good transition. And it's as important for reproduction as it is for milk production. If we get transition right, recent American data is showing that you can get up to sort of 3, 4, 5 kilo benefit from improvements in the transition period. Any breakdown in these physiological goals can lead to metabolic problems, so it's important that we actually put a huge effort in this area. We have to respect the fact that metabolic problems are probably underdiagnosed, and we ought to do more to try and monitor by blood testing cows pre-calving, just in the week prior to calving, just to check calcium levels. And we also have got to understand that everything's interrelated, and the egg development is occurring at the crucial stage. So the egg development around calving is at a crucial stage, and if we actually damage the eggs at that point, then that will actually destine the fertility in the future to be poor. So busy graph, that just shows you what happens and what contributes towards poor fertility within a dairy herd. So it can be infection, it can be housing, it can be comfort, it can be lameness, subclinic acidosis, calving, all of these issues, all of them are interlinked. And you can see here particularly things like ketosis. This is a big driver for a lot of problems, DAs, mastitis, reduced dry matter intake, again, big driver. So all of these things interact. This slide here shows some fertility. Down the left here is the conception rate, and this is according to days calved. And in this particular herd, they had a poor transition program, and you can see what was happening. It was very difficult to get cows in calf. Less than 100 days. The early services delivered poor results, and this is because the oocytes and the cows were being damaged during the transition period. This is an even more severe example of it. So in this herd, unbelievably so, it seemed to be that the conception rates were almost at 70% once we actually got services at this point after calving. But in the early stages, when we wanted to get them pregnant, to get a good calving interval, that wasn't achievable. So, if we get a decent transition, we should have a situation where the conception rates are more like this. We should get good conception rates, 50 to 90 days calved. These are just some farms that John visited, and this is one where obviously if you have pens which have more than 80% stocking density in the close-up group, these cows don't have a drive to eat, they get competition, the competition and stress will stop them eating, and that will contribute to fertility problems later. Similar slide showing the same sort of situation where, if you have not enough space requirement here, this looks a fairly stressy environment. The cows do look well, but to some extent psychologically there's a lot of potential stress here, and certainly heat build-up could be an issue as well. Water, really important to get that right, and making sure we have adequate water The typical figure we'd look at is 10 centimetres of trough length per cow as a minimum, and the water quality has to be good for it to work. We need good water for good rumen function. This is a farm that John visited, and it had a fertility problem, and this was the water in the transition pen. It was frozen. So, you know, if we don't deliver water to the cows, then the rumen will not function properly and we'll end up with problems. Again, just a slide that just shows great investments here in fan and self-locking yokes, but you do have to feed the cows. The cows do need to be fed, and in this particular herd that was what the problem was. The cows are running out of food, and they need to have food in front of them all the time if we're going to prevent energy deficit and keep that rumen healthy. And that was a consistent finding amongst many of the herds that John visited around the world where they had fertility problems. It seemed to be this not feeding, not creating enough space for the transition cows. And again, this is a similar finding world over. Again, you can look at this and think, well, how conducive is it having a bar at that height to actually facilitate dry matter intakes? Is there enough food there that's palatable? Why are these cows waiting to be fed all the time? So, you know, we've got to sort of look at the simple things. That's what we've got to do to try and get the transition right. And I hope you can get the message here that it's so important, the presentation of food to these cows with an uncoupled appetite. These cows don't have a strong appetite. We've got to make it easy for them. So, final summary, very much a whistle-stop tour. You may need to watch one or two areas again, but the key element is stocking density and feed management. Trough space is a primary factor. We've got to get this 80 centimetres per cow trough space minimum in these pre-calving cows and post-calving cows. We want to minimise group changes, create a stress-free environment, and we ideally only want to change groups on a weekly basis rather than putting cows in every day. We want to make sure the cow comfort of the transition group is absolutely excellent. We have good safe surfaces for them to walk on, good ventilation and lighting. The ventilation is crucial. Heat stress in transition cows is really bad news because that will depress an appetite in a cow that's already got a depressed appetite and will get problems. If we get infection in those cows, the earlier we detect them and the more sort of aggressive the treatment, the better the response. So certainly in the States what they're doing is to have fresh cow management programs where they're looking for rumen fill, taking temperatures of the cows, they're taking positive action. They're not leaving these cows for the next vet visit in sort of 2 weeks' time. They will actually take positive intervention to really try and prevent those cows getting sick and prevent the dry matter intake drop. And the final sort of bit in the jigsaw is just making sure that the diet is formulated correctly. But there's no point having a correctly diet formulation if we can't deliver on the other areas. So I hope that's been of use to you. That summarises a 2-hour talk in probably half an hour, so but at least you know what you missed out on. Thank you.